At the top of the pyramid that represented Egyptian society, the monarch stood. He was granted ownership of all of Egypt by the gods, at least in theory. The literate and illiterate classes were divided in the Egyptian social structure. The literate class was the ruling class. They were a small fraction of the population, but they were the main criteria for determining the character of ancient Egyptian society and everything we knew about the civilization. Individuals were frequently more important than the positions they held. As a result, while the king established the scope of bureaucratic power, effective administration was ultimately dependent on the same pool of literal aristocrats without whom the king could not govern. And we'll state some of them as follows. Because an Egyptian king could not personally control every area of society, the role of the vizier was established as early as the Old Kingdom's golden era, with his most noteworthy achievements being the 2 pyramids constructed for him at Dashur. Sneferu started his work with the pyramid at Mitam, known as the False Pyramid, due to its shape. It resembles a tower more than a pyramid, and its exterior casing is surrounded by a massive mound of gravel. The Pyramid of Mitam was Egypt's first real pyramid, but it did not last. This is because changes were made to Imhotep's initial pyramid design, causing the exterior casing to sit on sand rather than rock, causing it to fall. The Crooked Period and the Red Pyramid are Sneferu's structures at Dashur, or North Pyramid. The Bent Pyramid gets its name from the fact that it rises at a 55-degree angle and then changes to a 43-degree angle of smaller stones, giving the impression of bending in towards the summit. The workers had finished the base and sides before recognizing that a 55-degree angle was too steep, and changing their plan to conclude the job as best they could. Sneferu appears to have grasped the issue and went on to construct his 3rd pyramid. Sneferu appears to have been a ruler unafraid of loss or sorrow. When the Bent Pyramid failed to satisfy his standards, he simply began over. The Red Pyramid, named after the use of reddish limestone in its building, was constructed on a firm foundation for better stability and rose at a 43-degree inclination. The Red Pyramid, 105 meters tall, was Egypt's first effective real pyramid. It was originally encased in white limestone, as were the other later pyramids, which crumbled away over time and were collected by locals for other. Following in the footsteps of Djoser's complex at Saqqara, Sneferu had mortuary temples and the other structures built around his pyramids, with priests overseeing day-to-day activities once the Red Pyramid was finished. All of this points to the stability of his rule, which he bequeathed to his son Khufu when he died. The ancient Greek authors referred to Khufu as Cheops, and he's best known for his Great Pyramid at Giza. In their works, the Greeks portrayed him as a tyrant who oppressed the people and compelled them to labor for him against their will. This perception may have been created by the tales contained in the Westcar Papyrus, a compilation of 4 stories written about the kings of the 4th dynasty and found by Henry Westcar in around 1824 CE. The papyrus contains 4 tales recounted by Khufu's sons, including one in which King Khufu summons a sorcerer who claims to be able to reconnect a decapitated head to a body. And some academics read his actions in requesting a demonstration as malicious or careless. In the reign of Khufu, Egypt became even wealthier as a result of his military battles against Nubia and Libya, as well as his lucrative trade deals with cities such as Byblos. He also invested in agricultural innovations to improve the livelihoods of his people. During his reign, the world's first documented dam was constructed in Wadi Jarawi, a mountain range west of modern Helwan. This dam improved water availability for farms and others in the town. The Great Pyramid of Giza is the final of the ancient 7 wonders of the world, and a distinguishing emblem of Egypt. It is situated on the Giza Plateau near the modern city of Cairo, and was constructed over 20 years during the rule of Khufu. Although many hypotheses exist regarding the pyramid's purpose, the most generally acknowledged idea is that it was built as a tomb for the king. However, how it was constructed remains a mystery to this day. Historians continued to dispute the idea of ramps going around the outside of the building to move the blocks into position. These theories persist despite a growing body of evidence proving that the pyramid was constructed by the ancient Egyptians using technical means that were most likely so common to them that they felt no need to document them. Nonetheless, the complexity of the interior passages, shafts, and chambers, as well as the nearby Osiris shaft, encourages the persistence of these fringe theories, as does the mystery of how the pyramid was built at all, and its orientation to a figure during that time, called Ammeia, was the vizier during the reign of Khufu in the 4th dynasty, and one of the king's relatives. He was in charge of building his Great Pyramid and keeping an eye over its construction works, and he was buried near Khufu's pyramid. The construction work of the pyramid was done by expert and unskilled laborers employed by the state for the job. These employees either offered to pay off a debt, performed community service, or were paid for their time. The annual inundation of the Nile River was important for Egyptian survival because it distributed rich soil from the riverbank all across the shore's farmlands. However, it also made farming those lands impossible during the flood. During these times, the government supplied work for farms by constructing large monuments. These were the individuals who performed the real, physical labor of moving stones, elevating obelisks, constructing temples, and constructing the pyramids that continue to amaze and motivate people today. Khufu was replaced by a family member outside the legal line called Jedefra after his death. Jedefra was Khufu's son, but he did not appear to be his designated heir. Some scholars believe Jedefra built the Great Sphinx of Giza, while others believe Khafre, his sibling and successor, built it. The Sphinx is the world's biggest monolithic monument, showing a recumbent lion's torso with a king's head and visage. Historically, this king's visage has been identified as Khafre's, but Dobrev and others believe it's Khufu's. It appears to have been constructed by Khafre because it is exactly in line with his pyramid complex, and the Sphinx's face resembles Khafre more than Khufu. Khafre's pyramid is the second largest in Giza, and his complex is almost as big as his father's. Little is known about his rule. According to Egyptian texts, he continued his father's policies and government model by concentrating power in the hands of his closest family members and exerting strict control over policies and laws. Following Khafre's demise, succession was temporarily disrupted again when Baka, Jedefri's son, took the throne. He did not even rule for a year before Menkaure, Khafre's son, took over as monarch. Both the Greeks and the Egyptian writings praise Menkaure. Menkaure, like his father and grandpa before him, started construction on his Giza pyramid and shrine complex. Menkaure's pyramid and complex are smaller than the other two, which represent a significant development in the history of the Old Kingdom, and one of the causes of its collapse. The resources required to construct the Great Pyramid were no longer accessible during Menkaure's period, but he did his best to establish an everlasting residence on par with his fathers and grandfathers. Quenra, Menkaure's son and designated successor, perished while this pyramid was being constructed, upsetting the dynastic succession, and Menkaure died before the pyramid complex was finished. Despite reigning for 30 years, he was unable to finish the work of his predecessors, which many historians attribute to the dwindling resources at his disposal. Shepseskaf, Menkaure's successor, finished Menkaure's structure at Giza, but was buried in a relatively modest mastaba at Saqqara. As previously stated, the monarchs diverted immense resources to their funerary structures and buildings, but these temples and sanctuaries were increasingly under the authority of the priests who managed them, rather than the king. Although the Giza Plateau is now an old, sand-swept location on the outskirts of Cairo, it was a city of the deceased, inhabited by the living who tended to it during Menkaure's time. Giza had priests' houses, shrines, worker accommodations, stores, factories, breweries, and all the amenities of a small metropolis. The civilian life in ancient Egypt was very active. The lowest social class consisted of peasant farmers who did not own the land on which they worked on or the houses in which they resided. The monarch, members of the court, nomarchs, and priests owned the land. To begin the day, peasants would say, "Let us work for the nobility." Peasants were virtually always farmers, regardless of what other trade they practiced. They cultivated and harvested their crops, giving the majority to the landowner while keeping part for themselves. Most had private gardens, which the ladies maintained while the men worked in the fields. The lowest stratum of society created the items utilized in commerce, allowing the civilization as a whole to survive. These peasants were also part of the workforce that erected Egypt's pyramids and other monuments. When the Nile River's banks overflowed, farming became difficult, and the men and women went to work on the king's projects. This labor was always rewarded, and no literary or physical evidence supports the assertion that any of Egypt's major monuments were erected by slave labor. Work building monuments like the pyramid and associated burial complexes, temples, and obelisks provided the peasantry with the sole possibility of upward mobility. Skilled painters and engravers in particular were in high demand in Egypt, and were paid more than unskilled laborers who merely hauled the stones for the construction from one location to another. Peasant farmers might also raise their status by learning a craft and producing the vases, bowls, plates, and other ceramics that people need. Skilled carpenters could make a fortune by making tables, desks, chairs, beds, and storage chests, while painters were needed to decorate upper-class dwellings, castles, tombs, and monuments. Brewers were likewise held in high regard, and breweries were occasionally controlled by women. They appear to have been operated on by females in early Egyptian history. Beer was the most popular beverage in ancient Egypt, and it was commonly utilized as a kind of recompense. 3 times a day, workers on the Giza Plateau were given a beer ration. The deity Osiris was said to have provided the drink to the people, and breweries were overseen by the goddess Tenene. Marriages were more secular than religious in ancient Egypt. The parents planned the majority of weddings in any of the classes. Girls were often married at the age of 12, and boys at the age of 15. Royal offspring were frequently promised to foreign monarchs as babies to seal treaties. The ancient Egyptians' lives were not all labor. They found plenty of time to have fun by participating in sports, board games, and other activities. Hockey, handball, archery, swimming, tug-of-war, gymnastics, rowing, and a sport known as water jousting, which was a sea battle played in small boats on the Nile River in which a jouster tried to knock the other out of his boat, while the second team member maneuvered the craft, were all ancient Egyptian sports. The festivals of ancient Egypt were individually distinct in their own right, depending on the nature of the occasion, but they all had one thing in common: drinking and feasting. The Egyptian diet consisted mostly of grains, wheat, and vegetables. The meat was incredibly expensive, and only royalty could afford it. The 4th dynasty ended with Shepsekhof's brief reign, and the 5th started with much less hope. The 5th dynasty is known as the Sun King's dynasty because so many of their titles contain the name of the deity Ra, usually given as Re. The first 3 of these rulers, Userkaf, Sahur, and Kakai, would later be memorialized as divinely chosen in the Westcar papyrus tale, The Birth of the Kings. The dynasty starts with King Userkaf, but a lady called Kenkaz, most likely a daughter of Menkor, appears prominently in the Egyptian texts as mother of 2 kings of Upper and Lower Egypt, though it's unclear who those monarchs were. Her monument is the 4th pyramid at Giza, and she was a significant person. Not much is known about her. Userkaf is best renowned for his work on the Temple of the Sun and Abusir. This structure represents a significant divergence from the position of the monarch at the beginning of the 4th dynasty, and the beginning of the end of Giza as the king's necropolis. The sun deity Ra was now venerated directly by the people through the priesthood, and the king's position as the god's primary representative was reduced. Yuzurkov's son Sahur replaced him and constructed his funerary complex at Abusir near the Temple of the Sun. Sahur was a capable monarch who led the first Egyptian expedition to Punt and arranged significant trade treaties with other countries. Punt, on the other hand, was one of his biggest accomplishments, as it became an important source of many of Egypt's most valuable resources, and in time was regarded as a legendary country of the gods. Sahur constructed his own temple to the sun in Abusir and was the first to use palmiform columns in the building, which would later become the norm for columns throughout Egypt. Sahur's war exploits and cautious resource management enriched the nation, as demonstrated by the intricate work done on his mortuary complex and the inscriptions discovered. His son, Neferkare Kakai, succeeded him. Inscriptions suggest he was a good king and well-regarded, but little is known of his tenure except that the priesthood got even more dominant during his control. His son, Neferefre, succeeded. Local authorities focused on their areas and lacked the means and motivation to assist the rest of the nation. As the 6th dynasty died out, Egypt gradually descended into the first intermediate period. The Old Kingdom on the scale of Giza's pyramids were no longer constructed within the first intermediate period because there was no strong central sovereign to order and pay for them, and no administration to coordinate the large workforce. The cultural image that comes from a study of historical data does not support a chaotic, dark era, but rather a different social and political model than what had come before. There is some historical evidence for the claim of unrest and claimed disorder, which stems from the absence of a single powerful central government. The country's different regions were essentially self-governing. The dearth of information about the kings of the 7th and 8th dynasties attest to their ineffectiveness. Their identities and dates will be forgotten in Egyptian annals. The ancient city of Memphis was abandoned at some time by rulers who saw themselves as the heirs of the Old Kingdom kings. The rulers of the 9th and 10th dynasties then seized Heracleopolis as their center and declared themselves Egypt's real kings. Intef, a Theban nomarch who bore the customary epithets of Great Overlord, of the Nome, and Overseer of Priests, came to prominence in Thebes around 2125 BC and opposed the authority of Heracleopolitan kings. Intef I established Egypt's 11th dynasty and provided the push for the country's unity. During the Middle Kingdom, he was known as Intef the Mighty, and a monument in his honor was erected in the Temple of Karnak. And this was the way leading to the beginning of a new era, which was the Middle Kingdom. Military accomplishments and construction projects. Mentuhotep's successor, Mentuhotep III, reigned during 2010 to 1998 BCE, maintained and expanded his programs. He dispatched an army to Punt and strengthened the northern delta's borders. Mentuhotep IV replaced him. His entire 7-year rule is silent, but he most likely continued his predecessor's policies effectively because the nation is thriving when Amenemhat replaces him as monarch. When Amenemhat was Mentuhotep IV's vizier and was sent with his mission to quarry stones for the king's project, he had an inscription made of the extraordinary events he witnessed. First, a gazelle gave birth on the stone selected for the king's sarcophagus top, indicating that the stone had been chosen correctly because it was endowed with fecundity and life. Second, an unanticipated rainfall descended on the celebration, revealing a well big enough to water the entire gathering. This inscription was later interpreted to mean that Amenemhat was chosen by the gods to become king, as the gods had allowed him to experience miracles. Amenemhat I abandoned Thebes for unknown reasons and established his seat in court in Ititawi, south of Memphis. Amenemhat I's successor, Sennacherib I, 1971 to 1926 BCE, improved the country's infrastructure and initiated the kinds of grand building projects that had characterized the Old Kingdom and represented the king's power, including a temple to Amun at Karnak, which sparked the construction of the Great Temple complex there. Amenemhat I had followed in the footsteps of Intef II and Mentuhotep II by restricting the authority of local nomarchs and priests, and giving power only to those most trusted in the family. Sennacherib I continued the same strategy. The administration of the 12th dynasty was so effective that, unlike the Old Kingdom, it kept wealth centralized with the monarch while allowing for the development and prosperity of individual regions, without allowing them to become too strong.
The royal tombs were covered by burial mounds, since to create the tomb, a deep pit had to be sunk into the ground. The soil from this pit was then put back into the pit after the king was buried. This is a phenomenon found in other civilizations too, so that the burial site could be seen from afar.
Amenemhat III boasted of no major military triumphs, but constructed almost as many monuments as his father and was responsible for the vast mortuary sanctuary at Hawara, known as the Labyrinth. Amenemhat IV, 1815 to 1807 BCE, replaced him and maintained his policies. He completed his father's construction tasks and began many of his own. During his reign, military and commercial expeditions were undertaken on numerous occasions, and trade thrived with towns in the Levant, particularly Byblos and elsewhere. The co-regency policy, if it was implemented, had guaranteed a seamless transfer of power from ruler to ruler, but it failed in the case of Amenemhat IV, who had no male successor to prepare for success. After his demise, the throne passed to his sister, or probably wife, Sobonefru, 1807 to 1802 BCE, whose rule is little known, unless the Queen Nitocris of the 6th dynasty of the Old Kingdom is accepted as real. Sobonefru was the first woman to govern Egypt since the early dynastic period. The 12th dynasty concluded when she perished without an heir, and the 13th started with the reign of Sobekotep I, 1802 to 1800 BCE. The Middle Kingdom's 12th period was the most powerful and wealthy. The 13th dynasty would receive the riches and the policies, but would be unable to put them to good use. The 13th dynasty appears to have maintained the policies of the 12th dynasty monarchs and kept the nation united, but none of them had the personal power of the previous kings, according to incomplete documents. Lower Egypt started to develop its political groups. Rulers of the 13th dynasty relocate the capital from Ititawi to Thebes, the former capital of the late 11th dynasty in Upper Egypt, thereby weakening their grip on the north. Amenemhat I, 1991 to 1962 BCE, established the tiny settlement of Hudwarat in the far north at the start of the 12th dynasty, which developed into a commercial hub with easy access to the sea and road paths to Sinai and the area of Palestine. During the 13th dynasty, effective trade and immigration brought an increase of Semitic people to Avaris, who ultimately grew wealthy and powerful enough to wield governmental power in the nation. These individuals were known to the Egyptians as Hekakosset or Hyksos. The name of the Hyksos remains unclear. Many hypotheses have been proposed, including the possibility that they were refugees escaping the Aryan invasion of Asia. The Nordic invasion hypothesis has been debunked, as has this assertion. The Egyptians refer to them as Asians, but this was a word used for anyone beyond the country's eastern boundary, from the Levant to Mesopotamia. During the late 13th dynasty, the Egyptian monarchs ceased supplying the border fortifications located in Nubia, and no additional soldiers were stationed there. The troops, who were already stationed at the forts, were never returned to Egypt, and the former garrisons became their permanent residence. These troops served as commerce intermediaries between the Egyptian city of Thebes and the kingdom of Kush. As the 13th dynasty neglected matters to the south, just as they were doing to the north, the kingdom of Kush developed into a centralized power, with its capital at Kerma. Some of the ancient Egyptian fortifications along the border were destroyed at some time, presumably during an assault, though this is unclear. What is evident is that as Egyptian government in Thebes disregarded Kush's influence in the south, Kush's power increased, and the boundary became more flexible. The troops who had been left behind no longer saw it as their duty to protect against invasions, and had grown more acclimated to the role of traders than military men by this point. The monarchs documented for the latter portion of the 13th and 16th dynasties are non-Egyptians, or at the very least, do not have Egyptian names and are considered Hyksos rulers. The line is muddled, and some names are only known from ceremonial items, while others are only known from pieces of kings' lists, making dating problematic. The Hyksos achieved economic dominance of the eastern delta and then pushed north, negotiating treaties and forging contracts with various nomarchs, governors, of other districts in Lower Egypt, until they had conquered a sizable amount of territory and could exert political authority. Once established in Avaris, the Hyksos elevated Egyptians to positions of power, adopted Egyptian customs and attire, and absorbed Egyptian deity worship into their own beliefs and ceremonies. The Hyksos monarchs established Egypt's 15th dynasty, but once they were evicted, the invading Thebans destroyed all traces of the Hyksos in Egypt. Only a few Hyksos rulers are known by name thanks to the ruins of inscriptions and other texts discovered at Avaris and elsewhere, including the best known, Apepi. Apepi was also known as Apophis, and had an Egyptian name related to the giant snake Apophis or Apep, the sun god Ra's nemesis. At the same time the Hyksos rose to prominence in northern Egypt, the Nubians rose to power in the south. The Middle Kingdom's 13th dynasty, like Lower Egypt's, had forgotten to pay attention to its southern frontier. Thebes remained Upper Egypt's capital, but instead of dominating the entire nation, it was wedged between the Hyksos in the north and the Nubians in the south. According to Manetho, Apepi of the Hyksos wrote to the Theban king, Seqenenrentah, 1580 BCE, "Do away with the hippopotamus pool to the east of the city, for it prevents me from sleeping day and night." The message was most likely about the Theban practice of hippopotamus hunting, which would have been insulting to the Hyksos, who worshipped Set and included the hippo in their religious observances. Tao, rather than complying with the request, saw it as a challenge to his autonomy and marched on Avaris. His mummy indicates that he was slain in battle, and this, together with the events that follow, reveals that the Thebans were vanquished in this fight. Tao's son Chamos took up the cause, lamenting bitterly in an inscription about having to pay the Asiatics taxes and dealing with outsiders to the north and south of him and his kingdom. He launched a huge attack on the Hyksos, destroying Avaris according to the narrative. Chamos reports that his attack was so fast and scary that it rendered the Hyksos women barren, and that he destroyed the city to the ground following the carnage. This tale appears to be exaggerated, as the Hyksos retained control of Lower Egypt 3 years after Chamos' invasion, and Avaris remained the Hyksos' stronghold. Chamos was succeeded by his brother Ahmose, who, according to the inscriptions, drove the Hyksos out of Egypt and destroyed their metropolis of Avaris. These events are described in the tomb inscriptions of another man, Ahmose son of Abana, a soldier who fought under King Ahmose, who describes the devastation of Avaris and the retreat of the remaining Hyksos to Sharawin in the Palestine region. Ahmose then besieged this city for 6 years until the Hyksos fled again, this time to Syria, although what happened to them after that is unknown. Ahmose I not only established the 18th dynasty, but also began the new Kingdom of Egypt, the age of the Egyptian Empire. The Hyksos were responsible for the formation of a professional Egyptian army of conquest, since Ahmose I, and those who followed him, sought to ensure that no foreign nation ever gained such dominance in their land. That would become the new kingdom, a period of unprecedented prosperity and success in Egypt, is the legacy of the Second Intermediate Period. The 18th dynasty of Egypt, established by Ahmose I, would build some of the most renowned and memorable monuments since the Old Kingdom's pyramids, and expand Egypt's borders into a kingdom. Because previous Egyptian monarchs had permitted them to. As a result, he chose to establish protected areas around Egypt's boundaries and fortify neglected settlements in strategic locations to protect the nation. The Battle of Ahmose I against the Hyksos brought him and his troops into touch with the areas of Palestine and Syria, where he continued his operations while also conducting military excursions south against the Kingdom of Kush in Nubia. When he died, he had protected the nation and consolidated his authority, leaving a steady political and economic situation for his replacement, Amenhotep I, 1541 to 1520 BCE. Inscriptions show that Amenhotep I followed his father's policies and modeled himself after him as a warrior monarch, but he most likely only commanded battles into Nubia. There are no accounts of him conducting expeditions into Palestine or Syria, but he may have done so because those areas stayed secure during his and his successors' reigns. Thutmose I, 1520 to 1492 BCE, replaced him and immediately started wars to expand Egypt's reach. Thutmose I put down a revolt in Nubia that erupted soon after assuming the throne, personally murdering the Nubian monarch and suspending his corpse from the prow of his ship as a caution to other rebels. He then extended Egypt's control over Nubia further south before shifting his focus to Palestine and Syria. He expanded Thebes' famous Temple of Karnak and built numerous other temples and structures throughout Egypt. Thutmose II, 1492 to 1479 BCE, succeeded him, but little is known about his rule because he was quickly eclipsed by his more potent half-sister, Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut, 1479 to 1458 BCE, was one of the most potent and effective New Kingdom rulers. Thutmose II had one child with her, and he had another with a minor woman, Thutmose III, whom he named as his successor, 1458 to 1425 BCE. Following Thutmose II's death, Hatshepsut was appointed regent of Egypt and officially co-ruled with. She had been the force behind her husband's tenure, and continued to do so as she saw fit after his death. Hatshepsut is in charge of numerous construction initiatives. She conducted the most successful expedition to Punt, added her works to the temple at Karnak, and governed in harmony with Nubia to the south. Her construction undertakings were so beautiful and numerous that subsequent pharaohs claimed ownership of them. They were able to do so because Hatshepsut's name was taken from all of her structures, including her magnificent complex at Deir el-Bahri around 1458 BCE. Concerning the obelisks that were erected in the different temples, they were symbols of the sun god, and many of them can be found everywhere in the whole world, whether they were real Egyptian ones or modern ones imitating the ancient Egyptian obelisks. The process of carving one is not a paradox, as there is an unfinished one located in the quarries of granite in Aswan. Hatshepsut commissioned its construction, probably to accompany what became known as the Lateran obelisk, which was originally at Karnak, but was later brought to the Lateran Palace in Rome. Thutmose III inherited a wealthy and secure country in 1458 BCE, and wasted no time in improving it. Thutmose III establishes the Egyptian Empire, which his descendants would sustain. He defeated the neighboring countries and expanded Egypt's dominion further than it had ever been before, using the war chariot acquired from the Hyksos, bronze weaponry, and better strategies. Over 20 years, he led at least 17 separate military campaigns, subduing kingdoms from Libya to Syria and extending Egypt's authority in the south, from the region around Buin down to Kirgis. When Hatshepsut died, Thutmose III ascended to power. Believing him to be weak and inexperienced, the king of the Syrian city of Kadesh instigated a revolt in the Egyptian province of Canaan, which swiftly gathered support from other places aiming to dethrone Egypt. This coalition met in the city of Megiddo. Thutmose III marched his army from Thebes to Megiddo in northern Canaan, prudently choosing a narrow pass from the town of Aruna instead of the wider and easier routes to the city, and surprised his enemies by entering the Kina Valley behind their defensive positions and driving them from the field. Thutmose III had to lay siege to the city to seize it. Janeni, who was Thutmose III's commander and military scribe, naturally accompanied his monarch in war to put down the rebellion, and wrote a record describing the fight. Thutmose III was so taken by Jani's tale that he had sections of it written on the walls of the Great Temple of Amun at Karnak, and, to a lesser extent, elsewhere. Janeni begins by describing why the writing on the temple's walls exist. He then goes on to explain the campaign and its motivations. The wretched adversary referenced on several occasions is the king of Kadesh, who started the revolt and gathered the armies against Egypt. But it is also used to refer to everyone who joined the rebellion at times. Following the Battle of Megiddo, Thutmose III would subdue and punish those who took part, capturing not just Kadesh, but also all of Syria and the Mitanni territories in Mesopotamia. He was succeeded by his son Amenhotep II, 1425 to 1400 BCE, who inherited and built on his father's powerful and safe kingdom. He was not a warrior king, but he did order many construction projects and signed peace treaties and commerce deals with other countries, such as Mitanni. Thutmose IV, 1400 to 1390 BCE, his replacement, carried on his programs. Based on readings of his renowned dream stele, which recounts the tale of how he came to the kingdom, Thutmose IV is regarded as a usurper, although he is the legal son of Amenhotep II. He's best known as the king who rebuilt Giza's Great Pyramid. He the first ascended to the throne and continued Egypt's reform and revival, adding his own touches to the big project at Karnak, and grooming his successor for dominance, his son Ramses II, 1279 to 1213 BCE. He is the most well-known pharaoh of Egypt today. Ramses II governed Egypt for 67 years, and the magnificent temples and monuments he constructed in celebration of his conquests and accomplishments still stand as a testament to the wealth of his reign. There is hardly any ancient Egyptian site that does not mention Ramses II, and the story of his triumph in the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BC is legendary. However, one of his greatest acts as pharaoh was not one of battle, but one of peace. The forging of the first peace treaty in history. Anatolia's Hittites had been gaining prominence since the 2nd millennium BC, and by 1530 BC they had surpassed Babylonia as a notable nation, and they were putting Egypt to the test. Letters of intent had been addressed to the 18th dynasty's king Akhenaten, but he had never responded or taken note of Hittite activities along his boundaries. Horemheb had waged unsuccessfully against the Hittites, who had grown even more strong by the time of Tutankhamun, Akhenaten's successor, and were daring enough to garrison districts on or near Egypt's borders. When Horemheb became pharaoh in 1320 BCE, he initiated a more forceful campaign against the Hittites and secured Egypt's frontiers. Although the problem of the Hittite invasions was never fully overcome. Seti I had gained Palestine and Kadesh for Egypt, but happy with the victory, had made no plans for the city's defense. Now, Ramses II of the 19th dynasty had to cope with the problem of the Hittite invasion, and gathered his forces at Ramses in 1274 BC to remove the Hittites from Kadesh and weaken their army. Riding in his chariot at the head of 4 divisions, 20,000 soldiers, Ramses II marched his first division so quickly that he soon outdistanced the other 3. Near Kadesh, 2 Bedouins were apprehended and asked about the whereabouts of Muwatalli II and his army, to which they replied that the army was nowhere near Kadesh, and that Muwatalli II feared Egypt and the young king. The Bedouins, however, were Hittite spies, and Muwatalli II had already fortified Kadesh, with his chariots, 3,500 of them, and troops, 37,000 men, waiting just over the next hill. According to some combat accounts, Ramses II caught several more spies who told the awful reality about his condition, but the information arrived too late. Ramses II had separated himself from the rest of his army in his haste to seize Kadesh and vanquish the Hittite ruler. Just as the Hittite chariots slammed into his camp, he dispatched messages to the Ta division arrived in time to prevent an Egyptian army defeat, and Ramses II personally led the remaining Amman division into action many times, pushing the Hittite soldiers back onto the Orontes River, where many perished. Muwatalli II just only marched from Kadesh's walls to trap Ramses II's forces between his army by the river and his advance. But for unexplained reasons, he chose to stay in the city and never committed his reserve men to fight. Ramses II declared a great triumph at Kadesh and had a scribe record his narrative of the wonderful fight. Muwatalli II's version differed significantly, most notably in claiming Kadesh as a Hittite victory. While Ramses II did not capture the city, he did break the Hittite army on the field. And while Muwatalli II kept possession of Kadesh, he did not destroy the Egyptians as he had intended. Meren-Ta was Ramses II's 12th son, and not his designated successor. He only became pharaoh because all of his siblings had perished during their father's lengthy rule. Meren-Ta soon adopted his father's image of a warrior monarch, defeating the Libyans in combat and repelling an attack on the Sea Peoples. His description of his exploits include the well-known Meren-Ta stele, which contains the first reference to the Israelites as a tribe. Going forth to the 20th dynasty, Ramses III was the new kingdom's last powerful king. After Horemheb restored the ancient faith, the priests of Ammon's authority grew steadily, drawing income and influence away from the monarchy. Throughout the Ramesside era of the 20th dynasty, the condition deteriorated. The concept of having a war was existing as the threat of the people was remarkably increasing, which forced Ramses III to declare war over them. The nationality of the Sea Peoples is unknown because the only records of their activities are from Egyptian sources that only describe them in the terms of battle, such as the record from the Tanna stele, which reads in part, "They came from the sea in their warships, and none could stand against them." This is characteristic of Egyptian allusions to these enigmatic invaders. Ramses II, his son and successor Meremta, and Ramses III are the 3 great pharaohs who chronicle their struggles and triumphs against the Sea Peoples. All claimed huge victories over their opponents, and their inscriptions include the most extensive documentation of the Sea Peoples. During the time of Pharaoh Ramses III, the Sea Peoples invaded and destroyed the Egyptian commerce hub at Kadesh, and then attempted to invade Egypt again. They began their operations with swift attacks along the coast, before pushing toward the delta. In 1180 BC, Ramses III subdued them, but they returned in force. Ramses III would have been aware of his predecessors' fights with these people and how violent they were. He decided against a field engagement and instead employed guerrilla tactics as a plan. He set up ambushes around the coast and along the Nile Delta, and his archers were especially efficient, putting them camouflaged along the beach to shower down arrows on the ships at his signal. The ships were set on fire with burning arrows once the crew was dead or drowning. After crushing the naval invasion, Ramses III turned his focus to what remained of the invading troops on land. He used the same tactics as previously, and in 1178 BC, the Sea Peoples were defeated off the coast of Zeus. Warriors gave Egypt back a brief time of its former glory before the Persians invaded their land again. This era comprises the 27th to 31st dynasties of Egypt. Egyptian resistance to Persian control, on the other hand, is visible throughout the area, and Egypt thrived under Persian rule because the Persian Shahs respected the culture. Ammeia of the 28th dynasty, Nectanebo I and Nectanebo II all governed the nation, commanded troops, and participated in construction projects in the manner of the great pharaohs of the past. Whoever was behind the revolts against Persian authority, Egypt's second conquest did not last long. Philip II of Macedon, 359 to 336 BCE, defeated the Greek city-states and incorporated them into Macedonian authority. When he was murdered in 336 BCE, he was preparing a grand expedition to subjugate Persia. He already had all of the means he would require for the conquest, which he entrusted to his son, Alexander. The pharaohs of the 30th dynasty upheld Egyptians' kingship's honor and left their impressive structures in the footsteps of those who came before them. So, while the late period may be considered the end of Egyptian sovereignty, it should not be considered the end of Egyptian civilization. Even today, Egypt's cultural accomplishments inspire respect, if not fear, and remain among the most popular and intriguing of the old world. Although times changed, current modern Egypt in the 21st century might look like a coming forward version of ancient Egypt. The Nile River is still sacred to the Egyptian people, and they still celebrate the same festivals of the ancient times, such as the spring festivals. The food is quite inspired by the authentic ancient food. The traditions are still there, and even the last development form of the ancient language called the Coptic is still spoken in Egypt in churches' prayers and the middle of their Arabic dialect. The modern people are proud of the legacy. It was seen in the parades that were done in Cairo for the transportation of the mummies to the civilization's museum, and the reopening of the Alley of the Sphinxes in Luxor. They're building new cities, digging their way to improve commerce with the highways dug in the middle of the mountains, passing through the deserts. They're almost opening the biggest museum in the whole world. Excavations unearth every day new discoveries which might lead soon to a discovery similar to that of the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922. And this land will always remain an attractive mystery, dazzling and enchanting people from all over the world with its magic and history.
The most impressive